The summer heat hung thick over the Arkansas woods that July morning in 1987. 14 experienced climbers had gathered at Horseshoe Canyon Ranch, their voices echoing off the limestone cliffs as they prepared for what should have been a routine training exercise. These weren't amateurs. These were skilled outdoorsmen, many of them military veterans, fire and rescue professionals, men who had scaled mountains and rappelled down cliffs hundreds of times before. They knew the risks. They knew the protocols. They knew that in climbing there is no room for error. But on this particular day, one single mistake would turn their training session into one of the deadliest climbing disasters in American history. The story of what happened that morning has been told and retold in climbing circles, whispered about in hushed tones at outdoor adventure shops, analyzed in safety courses across the country. It serves as a grim reminder that experience means nothing when basic safety protocols are ignored, that confidence can be deadly, that sometimes the difference between life and death is as simple as checking your equipment one more time. Let me take you back to that morning to understand how 14 lives were lost in a matter of seconds. Horseshoe Canyon Ranch sits in the heart of the Arkansas wilderness, a sprawling property known for its dramatic limestone formations and challenging climbing routes. By 1987, it had become a popular destination for serious climbers looking to test their skills against nature. The ranch owners had developed several established routes, complete with permanent anchor systems bolted into the rock face at the top of various cliffs. The group that arrived that July morning was there for a rappelling exercise. The plan was straightforward. They would ascend to the top of a cliff, secure themselves to the permanent anchor system, and rappel down in sequence. For men with their level of experience, this was basic stuff. Child's play, really. The kind of exercise they could do in their sleep. The cliff they chose rose approximately 150 feet above the rocky ground below. Not the tallest formation in the area, but high enough to provide a good workout, high enough to be exciting, and more than high enough to be fatal if something went wrong. As the morning sun climbed higher, the men made their way to the top of the cliff. They were in good spirits, joking with each other, discussing technique, enjoying the camaraderie that comes from shared adventure. Several of them had climbed together before. They trusted each other. They trusted their equipment. They trusted the permanent anchors that had been installed in the rock, and that trust would kill them. The permanent anchor system at the top of the cliff consisted of bolts drilled into the limestone, designed to provide secure attachment points for climbing ropes. These systems are standard at popular climbing locations. When properly installed and maintained, they're incredibly strong, capable of holding thousands of pounds of weight. Climbers rely on them constantly. But here's what the 14 men didn't know. Here's the critical piece of information that would have saved their lives if only they had checked. The anchor system had been compromised. The exact cause of the failure has been debated over the years. Some investigations suggested that the bolts had been improperly installed in the first place, drilled into fractured limestone that couldn't hold under stress. Others pointed to gradual deterioration over time, as weather and repeated use weakened the rock around the bolts. Still others suggested that recent rainfall had seeped into cracks in the limestone, creating internal stress fractures that weren't visible from the surface. What everyone agreed on was this: the anchor system was going to fail. It was just a question of when. The first climber prepared to rappel. He double-checked his harness, tested his rope, and backed over the edge of the cliff. His descent was smooth, controlled, perfect. He reached the bottom without incident and unclipped from the rope, waving up at his companions to signal that all was clear. The second climber followed, then the third. Each successful descent increased the group's confidence. Everything was working exactly as it should. The rope ran smoothly through the anchor. The system held firm. There was no indication of any problem whatsoever. By the time the fourth climber was halfway down the cliff face, Over a dozen men had gathered at the top, waiting their turn. Some were already clipped into the rope, ready to go. Others stood nearby, watching the descent, chatting about their plans for the rest of the day. And then, without warning, it happened. The anchor failed. Not gradually. Not with any warning sign or preliminary crack. It simply gave way all at once, catastrophically, completely. The sound was later described by survivors as a sharp metallic ping, followed immediately by screaming. The bolts ripped out of the limestone, as if they had been held in place by nothing more than paper. The entire anchor assembly, along with everyone and everything attached to it, went over the edge. 14 men fell. Some were clipped directly to the rope. Others were standing so close to the anchor system that when it failed, they were pulled over the edge by the sudden, violent movement. A few had just enough time to realize what was happening before gravity took over. Most didn't even have that. 150 feet is a long way to fall. In the seconds it took for those men to hit the ground, every one of them knew they were going to die. There was no water below to break their fall, no trees to grab onto, nothing but hard Arkansas stone waiting at the bottom. The impact was devastating. Bodies hit the rocks at terminal velocity, suffering massive trauma instantly. The lucky ones died on impact, their brains shutting down before they could process the pain. Others weren't so fortunate, suffering catastrophic injuries that left them conscious and in agony for the minutes it took help to arrive. The climbers who had already completed their descent watched in absolute horror as their friends fell from the sky. One moment they had been looking up, waiting their turn. The next moment they were witnessing a massacre, helpless to do anything but scream. The survivors immediately radioed for emergency services, but they knew even as they made the call that it was futile. You don't fall 150 feet onto rocks and survive. Not 14 people, not like this. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies were scattered across the rocky ground at the base of the cliff, broken and twisted in ways that bodies shouldn't bend. Blood pooled between the stones. Climbing equipment lay tangled everywhere, rope and carabiners and harnesses that had done nothing to save the men wearing them. All 14 climbers died. Not immediately, but within hours. Some at the scene, others during the frantic helicopter evacuations to nearby hospitals. Their injuries simply too severe for medicine to overcome. A few held on longer, fighting against the inevitable, but the damage was too extensive. Multiple organ failure, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injuries, shattered bones that had punctured vital organs. One by one, they slipped away. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. The National Park Service sent specialists. Climbing organizations dispatched their safety experts. Engineers examined what was left of the anchor system. Everyone wanted to know how this could have happened. How 14 experienced climbers could die doing something they had done hundreds of times before. The findings were sobering. The anchor bolts had been installed incorrectly years earlier, drilled into a section of limestone that had pre-existing fractures. Over time, repeated stress from climbers using the system had gradually widened these fractures. Recent heavy rainfall had seeped into the cracks, further weakening the rock's integrity. On the morning of the accident, the limestone around the bolts was essentially held together by little more than friction and hope. When the weight of multiple climbers was applied simultaneously, several men clipped to the same anchor system all at once. It exceeded the compromised rock's ability to hold. The bolts pulled free. The anchor failed. 14 men died. But here's the thing that makes this tragedy so particularly heartbreaking. Here's the detail that transforms this from a terrible accident into an absolute nightmare of preventable death. The climbers should have inspected the anchor before using it. Standard climbing protocol, taught in every basic mountaineering course, emphasizes the importance of inspecting all equipment before trusting your life to it. This includes fixed anchors. You're supposed to examine the bolts. Look for signs of wear or corrosion. Check that the rock around the anchor points is solid. Give the system a test pull before committing your full weight to it. These men were experienced enough to know this. They had been trained in these protocols. They understood the theory behind safety checks. But they were also confident. They had used permanent anchors countless times before, without incident. These bolts were already in place, installed by professionals, used by other climbers regularly. Why would they fail now? It seemed unnecessarily cautious to waste time inspecting something that was obviously working fine. This is called normalization of deviance. It's when people gradually accept lower and lower standards of safety because nothing bad has happened yet. It's the reason so many disasters occur, not because of ignorance but because of complacency. Because experienced people convince themselves that their experience makes them immune to basic safety requirements. If even one person in that group had taken 60 seconds to inspect the anchor system, they would have noticed something was wrong. The rock around the bolts would have felt loose. A test pull might have revealed movement where there should have been none. The fractures in the limestone might have been visible with close examination. 60 seconds. That's all it would have taken to save 14 lives. Instead, confidence replaced caution. Experience substituted for inspection. And 14 families received visits from solemn-faced officials, telling them that their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons were never coming home. The aftermath of the Arkansas climbing disaster rippled through the outdoor adventure community like a shockwave. Climbing organizations around the country immediately updated their safety protocols. Training courses began emphasizing the inspection of fixed anchors with renewed urgency. The phrase "check your anchors" became something of a mantra in climbing circles, repeated so often that it began to feel almost religious in its importance. Horseshoe Canyon Ranch was devastated. The owners had operated in good faith, believing their installed anchors were safe. The tragedy destroyed them emotionally and financially. They faced lawsuits from the victims' families. Their reputation was ruined. Within 2 years, the ranch would close permanently, unable to recover from the shadow of that July morning. The families of the 14 victims struggled to make sense of their losses. How do you process the death of a loved one in such a sudden, violent, preventable way? These men hadn't died in war, or from disease, or in car accidents. They had died doing something they loved, something they were good at, because of a mistake so simple it seemed almost insulting. Several of the widows became advocates for climbing safety, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of equipment inspection. They turned their grief into purpose, determined that their husbands' deaths would at least serve as a warning to others. Don't let confidence replace caution. Don't assume that because something has worked before it will work again. Don't trust your life to equipment you haven't personally verified. In the years since the disaster, climbing safety has improved dramatically. Modern anchor systems use different materials and installation techniques. Regular inspection schedules have been implemented at popular climbing locations. The technology has advanced, the protocols have been refined, the culture has shifted toward an almost obsessive focus on safety. But the fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Check your equipment. Every time. No exceptions. The Arkansas nightmare serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when we forget that lesson. 14 experienced climbers died not because they lacked skill or courage or knowledge. They died because they made one mistake, one small compromise in their safety protocol, one decision to trust rather than verify. And that's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this entire tragedy. These men weren't reckless, they weren't stupid. They weren't doing anything that millions of other climbers haven't done. They were just unlucky enough to be the ones using that anchor system on the day it finally failed. which means it could have been anyone. It could have been any group of climbers, at any location, on any day. The only thing that separated these 14 men from every other climber who has ever used a permanent anchor is timing. They were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong anchor. Or to put it another way, they were normal climbers doing normal things who happened to skip one normal safety check on the one day when that safety check would have saved their lives. Think about that for a moment. Let it sink in. 14 men died because they didn't spend 60 seconds checking their equipment. 14 families were destroyed. 14 futures were erased. All because of one small oversight. The human mind struggles with this kind of randomness. We want to believe that disasters happen for big reasons, that tragedy requires major failures. We want to think that if we're careful and skilled and experienced, we'll be safe. The idea that one tiny mistake can have such catastrophic consequences feels wrong somehow. Unfair. Like the universe is playing a cruel joke. But nature doesn't care about fairness. Physics doesn't grade on a curve. Gravity shows no mercy to the experienced or the inexperienced alike. When an anchor fails, it fails completely. When you fall from 150 feet, you die. These are simple, brutal facts that no amount of skill or experience can change. The survivors of that day, the climbers who had already completed their descent and were waiting at the bottom when the anchor failed, they carry their own burden. Survivors' guilt is a powerful thing. Why did they go first? Why were they the lucky ones? If they had gone last instead, would they have died too? Or would they have noticed something wrong with the anchor and spoken up? These questions have no answers, but that doesn't stop the survivors from asking them. Over and over, late at night when sleep won't come and the memories of watching their friends fall from the sky play on endless repeat. Some of the survivors never climbed again. How could they? How could they ever trust another anchor, another rope, another piece of equipment after witnessing such a complete and total failure of the systems they had relied on for years? The joy was gone, replaced by hypervigilance and fear. Better to find a new hobby, one that didn't involve heights and ropes and the constant possibility of sudden death. Others went the opposite direction, becoming almost obsessive about climbing safety. They inspect everything 3 times. They over-engineer every system. They trust nothing and no one completely. They climb with the intensity that borders on paranoia, constantly expecting the next disaster, the next failure, the next tragedy. Neither response is particularly healthy, but both are understandable. Trauma changes people. Watching 14 friends die in front of you changes people. There's no going back to the innocence of that July morning, when climbing was fun and anchors were trustworthy and death was something that happened to other people. The climbing community as a whole was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths in the wake of the Arkansas disaster. They had to acknowledge that their sport was dangerous, that permanent installations required maintenance and inspection, that experience could breed dangerous complacency. The culture shifted from one that celebrated bold risk-taking to one that emphasized careful preparation and redundant safety systems. This was probably overdue. Climbing had always carried risks, but as it grew in popularity through the 80s, more and more people were using established routes and fixed anchors without really understanding the systems they were trusting their lives to. The Arkansas tragedy served as a brutal wake-up call. A reminder that popularity doesn't equal safety, that just because other people have done something successfully doesn't mean it's safe to do now. Modern climbing has benefited enormously from these lessons. Anchor systems are better designed, more regularly inspected, and installed with far greater care than they were in 1987. Climbing instruction emphasizes personal responsibility and equipment verification. The technology has improved, but more importantly, the mindset has changed. Today's climbers are taught from day one to check everything themselves, to trust no one else's work until they've verified it personally. This creates redundancy, which creates safety. Even if one person misses something, hopefully someone else will catch it. The goal is to make disasters like the Arkansas tragedy impossible through a combination of better equipment and better culture. But we can never eliminate risk entirely. Climbing will always be dangerous. Rocks will always be hard. Gravity will always pull you down if your anchor fails. All we can do is minimize the chances of failure through careful preparation and constant vigilance. The 14 men who died that July morning would probably appreciate knowing that their deaths led to meaningful change. That climbing is safer now because of the lessons learned from their tragedy. That other families have been spared similar grief because the climbing community took this disaster seriously and made real improvements. It's small comfort to those who lost loved ones, but it's something. A purpose. A meaning. A reason why 14 good men had to die on what should have been a routine training exercise. In the end, the Arkansas nightmare teaches us that safety is never guaranteed, that experience can't protect us from basic mistakes, and that the price of complacency can be catastrophically high. It reminds us that in activities where the consequences of failure are severe, there is no such thing as being too careful. No such thing as unnecessary inspection. No such thing as wasted time spent verifying that our equipment will keep us alive. 14 men learned this lesson too late. Their deaths serve as a permanent warning to everyone who comes after them. Check your anchors. Inspect your equipment. Trust nothing until you've verified it yourself. Your life literally depends on it. And if you think you're too experienced to need these basic safety checks, if you believe your skill exempts you from following protocols, remember those 14 climbers in Arkansas who thought exactly the same thing right up until the moment the anchor failed and they fell to their deaths. They were experienced too. It didn't save them. Epilogue. 20 years after the tragedy, a memorial was erected at the base of the cliff where 14 men lost their lives. It stands there still today. A simple granite marker with their names carved into the stone. Families visit occasionally, leaving flowers and photographs, touching the engraved letters as if they could somehow reach through time and space to connect with the men they lost. The memorial has become something of a pilgrimage site for serious climbers. They come to pay their respects, to read the names, to stand in the exact spot where the bodies landed, and contemplate their own mortality. Many leave small tokens, climbing gear that has served them well, notes promising to always check their anchors, prayers for safe descents. The base of that cliff has been transformed from a place of death into a place of remembrance and renewed commitment to safety. One of the widows, a woman named Patricia Reynolds, spent the rest of her life campaigning for climbing safety reform. Her husband Mark had been among the 14 who fell that day. They had 2 young children at the time, ages 4 and 6, who grew up without their father because of one unchecked anchor. Patricia refused to let his death be meaningless. She testified before regulatory boards, spoke at climbing conferences, wrote articles for outdoor magazines, and personally funded safety inspection programs at climbing locations across the country. When she died in 2019, her obituary noted that she had probably saved more lives through her advocacy work than could ever be counted. The climbing community honored her at her funeral, hundreds of climbers gathering to rappel in synchronized tribute, each one carefully, deliberately checking their anchors before descending. The children of the 14 victims formed their own support group over the years. They discovered that they shared a unique bond, a trauma that outsiders could never fully understand. What's it like to lose your father in such a sudden, violent, preventable way? What's it like to grow up knowing that 60 seconds of inspection would have meant he'd be at your high school graduation, your wedding, the birth of your first child? These questions haunted them in ways that therapy could only partially address. Some of them became climbers themselves, as if by mastering the sport that killed their fathers, they could somehow reclaim power over their trauma. Others refused to even hike, unable to bear the sight of cliffs and ropes without experiencing crippling panic attacks. The rescue workers who responded that day, the paramedics and firefighters who had to bag 14 bodies and load them into helicopters, many of them struggled with post-traumatic stress for years afterward. Several left emergency services entirely, unable to continue in a profession that had shown them such horror. Others became vocal advocates for first responder mental health services, arguing that psychological support should be as routine as physical training. One paramedic, a man named James Chen, wrote a memoir about his experiences that day titled, "When the Anchors Fail." In it, he described in devastating detail what it was like to arrive at the scene, to realize that every single victim was beyond saving, to perform futile chest compressions on men whose injuries were so catastrophic that medical intervention was a cruel joke. The book became required reading in many emergency medical training programs, not for its climbing content, but for its honest exploration of trauma and grief in first responders. In the decades since the disaster, climbing technology has evolved in ways the 14 victims could never have imagined. Modern anchor systems use materials that didn't exist in 1987. Inspection techniques now include ultrasound testing that can detect internal fractures in rock that are invisible to the naked eye. Climbers carry devices that can measure the load-bearing capacity of anchors in real time. There are apps that track the maintenance history of every permanent anchor at registered climbing locations worldwide. The sport has been revolutionized by technology and tragedy in equal measure. But perhaps the most profound change has been cultural. The modern climbing community has developed what safety experts call a just culture, one where people are encouraged to speak up about potential hazards without fear of being mocked as overcautious. If someone at a climbing site today said they wanted to inspect a permanent anchor before using it, nobody would laugh or roll their eyes. Instead, others would join in the inspection, grateful that someone was taking safety seriously. The old culture of machismo and bravado, where questioning safety made you seem weak or inexperienced, has been largely eradicated. The Arkansas disaster killed that culture as surely as it killed 14 men. Horseshoe Canyon Ranch, after years of abandonment, was eventually purchased by a non-profit climbing organization. They renovated the property with state-of-the-art safety systems, turning it into a training facility specifically focused on climbing safety education. Students from around the world come to learn proper anchor inspection, equipment verification, and risk assessment. Every course begins with a visit to the memorial, a moment of silence for the 14 men, and a lecture about the dangers of complacency. The cliff where the tragedy occurred has been permanently closed to climbing. It stands as a monument, untouched, a scar on the landscape that serves as a constant visual reminder of what can go wrong. Some of the surviving climbers, the ones who were at the bottom when the anchor failed, eventually found ways to integrate their trauma into something resembling healing. They formed an organization called Check Twice, which provides free anchor inspection services at climbing locations. They've inspected thousands of permanent anchors over the years, finding and fixing dozens that were dangerously compromised. Each anchor they repair is marked with a small plaque that reads, "In memory of the Arkansas 14. It's their way of turning survivors' guilt into life-saving action, of ensuring that their friends didn't die for nothing. The engineering failures that led to the disaster have been studied exhaustively in materials science and civil engineering courses. The case appears in textbooks as a classic example of inadequate load testing and poor installation practices. Future engineers learn to calculate safety margins and account for environmental degradation by studying the exact mathematical reasons why those bolts failed. In a strange way, the 14 men have educated tens of thousands of engineers who will go on to design safer structures, safer systems, safer anchors. Their legacy exists in buildings and bridges that will never fail, in calculations that account for the unaccountable, in a generation of professionals who understand viscerally that shortcuts kill. On the anniversary of the disaster each year, climbers around the world participate in what's called the Arkansas Remembrance. At noon local time, wherever they are, they stop climbing. They check their anchors one extra time. They call out the names of the 14 men who died. Then they observe a minute of silence before resuming their climbs. It's a small ritual, but it keeps the memory alive, keeps the lesson fresh, ensures that new climbers entering the sport understand that they're part of a community that has paid a terrible price for the knowledge they now take for granted. The ultimate question, the one that can never be fully answered, is whether 14 deaths were necessary to learn these lessons. Could the climbing community have reformed its practices without such a catastrophic tragedy forcing their hand? Would anchor inspection have become standard practice eventually through gradual evolution rather than sudden revolution? We'll never know. What we do know is that those 14 men, through their deaths, changed an entire sport. They made climbing safer for millions of people who will never know their names. They created a culture of caution that has prevented countless similar disasters. Their final contribution to the sport they loved was involuntary and tragic, but it was also profound and lasting. The families left behind have found what peace they can. The pain never fully disappears, but it becomes integrated into who they are, a permanent part of their story rather than the defining chapter. They've watched their children grow up, graduate, marry, have children of their own. They've built new lives from the ruins of that July morning. And on quiet days, when the light hits a certain way or they catch a glimpse of limestone cliffs in the distance, they remember the men they lost and whisper a prayer that no one else will ever have to endure what they endured. The cliff still stands in Arkansas, silent and eternal, keeping its secrets. The anchor points have been removed, the rock face left bare. Nature slowly reclaims what humans briefly borrowed, and at the base, that granite memorial ensures that 14 names will never be forgotten, that their deaths will continue to teach long after everyone who knew them has passed away. Check your anchors. Trust nothing. Verify everything. The Arkansas 14 paid with their lives to teach us these lessons. The least we can do is remember them and honor their sacrifice by never making the same mistake they made. Their story ends on that cliff, but their legacy continues in every climber who takes an extra moment to inspect their equipment, in every life saved by caution, in every person who comes home safely because they remembered what happens when anchors fail. 14 men fell, millions learned, and climbing will never be the same.